I wanted to cover just a few things very quickly in preparation for the loop test. One of the things that you'll see in some of the code on the test is the use of the scanner class, which is not a part of the AP subset, so you are not required to know it. I just want you to know when you look at these code samples, the scanner code is not a problem in any of these. You don't need to look at the scanner code and say, I don't know what it's doing. How do I know if it'll compile? What if the error's in the scanner code? On the test, none of the scanner code will give a compile error. None of it is wrong. It is correct. It is just a way to get values from the user via the keyboard. So don't focus on the scanner code when you're looking at these loops. You're focusing on the loop, not on the scanner. But when you see it, this is the line that basically says, hey, set up an object name in to let me get input from the keyboard. And this next in, or if you see next double or something like that, all that's doing is going to when the user types in the values on the keyboard, is grabbing them and storing them in X. And in the loop, in order to keep it from becoming infinite, you have to do the same thing. You have to get the next number. So if you had a question like this with the scanner in it, don't get hung up on scanner. You're looking at the loop and evaluating the loop and the loop condition. So in this case, if you were asked, when will this loop stop running? All you're really looking at is, what is the condition? The condition that keeps it running is x being greater than 0. So if x is 1, 2, 3 to a million, it will keep running. The question is, when does it stop? So if you're asked when it stops, don't say as long as x is greater than 0. That's what keeps it running. That's not what stops it. What stops it is the second the user enters either a 0 or a negative number. So be aware when you read a question that says, when does the loop stop? You're not, if you tell it, well, as long as x is greater than 0, that's the opposite of stop. That's what keeps it running. So you have to look at that and go, okay, it's going to stop. If x has to be greater than 0 for it to run, it must stop when x is either 0 or less than 0. In this case, I'm entering a 2. I'm entering a 3. If I enter a 0, it stops and tells me the sum. If I entered a -1, it would stop. So be aware when you're evaluating these questions. Be very careful to read what it's asking for and do not get hung up on the scanner. That's not what the question is about. You should also be able to recognize an infinite loop. In this case, there is a way out for the user the second they enter 0 or a negative number. This line will grab their input from the keyboard, and the second x becomes 0 or less than 0, this loop stops. So it's not infinite. It does have a way out for the user. If I left this line out, now I have a problem. Now I have an infinite loop. Because if the person enters a 2, for example, 2 is greater than 0, this thing runs and it keeps the value at 2. There's no way for the user to enter anything else. So x is always going to be 2, which is always greater than 0, and this will run forever. So I'm not going to run it and try it because it could actually crash my computer. So remember, if you have a while loop that's using some type of variable in the condition that determines when it stops, if you do not somewhere in the while loop, and it's usually at the end, but it can be anywhere in the loop, if you do not somewhere in that loop have some way that that variable is eventually going to be a value that stops the loop, then you have an infinite loop and you have a problem. If I wanted to, I could have the user enter a number, and the user enters a 2, and then I could set up some code that says, we'll take whatever the user's entered and subtract 100, assuming that the user enters something under 100. Then I've got a way that if the user enters 99 minus 100 is -1, the loop's going to stop. So what I'm trying to get at is that somewhere in a while loop, you have to make sure you have set up a code, a line of code, an if statement, something somewhere that eventually will get that condition to become false, will break the loop. So you should be able to identify an infinite loop. More likely to see an infinite loop in a while or a do while. Very unlikely to see an infinite loop in a for loop, because you almost have to do that intentionally. But it's very easy to accidentally make a while or do while loop infinite, because you as the programmer have to manage more consciously the variable in question, whereas the for loop, you set up those little 3 sections and it will help you manage that variable. Also pay attention to little details, to the most minute detail when you're looking at code. If I say that x is greater than 0 and I ask you when will the loop stop, don't tell me that it will stop when the user types a 1. The user has to type a 0 or a negative number, but here's the trick. Now what if I say run as long as x is greater than or equal to 0, and I ask you when is the loop going to stop? If you tell me when the user enters 0, you're wrong. The loop, you've got to zero in on even the smallest detail. This loop runs as long as x is greater than or equal to 0. So make sure you pay very close attention to whether it's equals, greater than equals, less than equals. I always do that when I have these things. I forget to so 1, now I've entered a 0, now I've entered a 3. In order to stop this, I have to enter a negative number. And I didn't mean to change that. That was an accident. So again, pay very close attention to what is in the condition for each loop that you're evaluating. Also pay attention to whether you've got a print or a print line. That makes a difference in the output. Now what if I have a loop that says, well, x is less than 5. I'm going to print out the value of x. I need a brace here because I'm going to have more than one line. And here I'm setting x equal to 0. So now I've got an entirely different loop. I've got a variable x. I started at 0. I am looping as long as the value in x is less than 5. It's not less than equal, it's less than 5. Which means I'm going to go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I'm done. And I'm going to do a print, not a print line, and here I'm making sure that I don't go infinite by bumping up x by 1, so eventually it will get to 5 and the loop will stop. Let's look at the output. So if I'm asking you what would be the output of this loop, don't tell me 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Because it's not. It's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. This stops when it gets to 5. If I stick equals in there, now I'm going to print out through 5. It's going to stop when it gets to 6. And don't tell me that they're all going to print on different lines. That's a print statement. They're all going to print right next to each other. If I want them to print on separate lines, I have to use a print line. So you've got to pay attention to those very minute details in the code. Another thing to remember is terminology. You might be asked, how many times does this loop execute? That means how many times does it loop? How many times does the code repeat? I might say, how many times does it run? How many times does it iterate? All of that means is basically, how many times is that print line going to fire off? And in this case, with x less than 5, x starts at 0. It's going to run 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, printing out the numbers 0 to 4. So it runs or executes or iterates or loops, whatever word you want to use, 5 times. Because what you're really being asked is, how many times is that print line going to fire off? And it's going to fire off or repeat 5 times. And I cannot say enough, when you're evaluating these loops, you have to pay attention to whether this is a less than equal, whether it's greater than or greater than equal, because that makes a difference in how many times it repeats. That makes a difference in how the code works. That can make a significant difference in the answer. So again, you've got to really pay attention to the condition, to the operator that's used in the condition of the loop. You also need to remember random number generation. Remember that if you say next int and you put a 6 in the parentheses, that generates a number from 0 to 5. And if you need it to be from 1 to 6, you have to put +1 on there. So you can't forget the things that you've already learned. You have to still remember ifs and random numbers and so on. Also remember that just about any for loop can be rewritten as a while loop, and just about any while loop can be rewritten as a for loop. They are very close together, close to each other. They're very compatible in that sense. Do while not so much, because a do while always executes one time. It's kind of its own unique thing. But while and for are probably 98% of the time interchangeable. So you may be asked to look at a while loop and say which for loop would do the same thing. You might be asked to look at a for loop and pick a while loop that does the same thing. The other thing that you need to be familiar with is Boolean values, which are true, false. You can use a Boolean value in a loop. Let me change it to another letter here. So you can say, for example, I'm going to create a value called y. It's going to hold the value false. I can say as long as y is false, okay, now I have a problem because I have an infinite loop. I have not flipped y to true, to the opposite of false, to break out. Now I have, so that's only going to run one time. It's not very useful, but I'm just trying to show you how Booleans work. You can also take a shortcut and say while not y. That, just memorize it. When you take a Boolean variable and you stick an exclamation point in front of it, that means while not true. Okay? So y is false. Putting the not in front of y basically says while y is false. That's the exact same thing as doing that. They are equivalent. While not true, while false, run. So this loop's going to do the exact same thing it did before. It's going to print out hello one time. Y is going to get flipped to true, and then it is going to stop. Because this means false, so the second that the value in y is set to true, the loop will break. So just be aware. You can also have the opposite condition where y starts out as true and you flip it to false to start, and the shortcut for that is you can just say while y. That's the same as saying while y equals true. Okay, so just a few little things to be aware of for the test.